I didn't expect the courtroom to go silent the moment I walked in, but there it was, 40 pairs of eyes turning toward me, some curious, some judgmental, and 2 of them openly mocking. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, rolling their eyes the same way they used to when I was a forgotten kid begging for their attention. Their attorney, a tall man in a navy suit, looked entirely too confident, shuffling his notes as if he already knew he'd win. But the moment the judge saw me, everything changed. He froze, his eyebrows lifted, then he leaned forward, squinting as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Wait, you're JAG, ma'am." Their attorney went pale. And in that suspended second, with my parents' smirks melting right off their faces, I realized the past 38 years of my life had all been leading to this moment, a moment I never wanted but one I was ready for. My name is Sarah Lawson, and this is the story of how my wealthy grandma left me $4.7 million, and how my parents, who ignored me my entire childhood, sued me to take every penny back. But to understand how we ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back to where it all began. I grew up in a small Midwestern town called Maple Falls, a place where the summers smelled like fresh-cut grass, and winters meant shoveling snow out of your driveway before dawn. Life there wasn't glamorous, but it was simple in the way only towns with 1 diner and 3 churches can be. My biological parents, Daniel and Linda Lawson, were Maple Falls' shining young stars. Dad had been the high school quarterback, the kind of guy whose Letterman jacket hung on the back of every local girl's imagination. Mom was the pretty cheerleader with the bright smile and the sharper tongue. They married young hot with passion, certain their future would be big and bright. Then I came along. I don't think they ever hated me exactly, but I know I wasn't part of their plan. I was the baby who slowed them down, the baby they didn't know what to do with, the baby who cried at night while they argued about money dreams and all the things they felt they were missing out on. When I was barely 2 years old, they dropped me off at my grandmother's house for a little while so they could get back on their feet. They never got back on their feet. And they never came back for me. My grandmother, Margaret Lawson, wasn't wealthy in an ostentatious way. She didn't wear diamonds or drive a Mercedes. She wore faded cardigans, baked blueberry muffins on Sundays, and spoke in a soft but firm voice that could calm any storm. Her wealth came from decades of running 3 small hardware stores across the county and investing in properties when the market was low. People in Maple Falls called her the quiet millionaire. When I was 5, I thought she was simply magic. When I was 10, I realized she was the only person who ever truly loved me. And by the time I was 15, I knew she was the person I wanted to grow up to be: steady, kind, fair, and unshakable. She never once badmouthed my parents, not when they missed birthdays, not when they forgot Christmas, not even when they showed up unannounced once every few years asking for money, pretending to care for all of 10 minutes before revealing what they really wanted. Grandma always refused politely and without anger. She'd pat my hand and say, "Sweetheart, some people grow in one direction. Some grow in another. You can't force a crooked tree to stand straight." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was older. It was Grandma who introduced me to the world of law, though neither of us realized it at the time. Whenever she came home from the courthouse, she often attended county meetings, probate hearings, or community legal sessions for her rental properties. She would bring back story after story. Stories of neighbors fighting over land. They didn't need disputes between brothers who hadn't spoken in years, or families torn apart by wills and inheritances. "Money can reveal who we truly are," she'd say, pushing up her reading glasses, for better or worse. Sometimes she'd let me sit beside her as she reviewed contracts and tenant agreements. I liked the feeling of the paper, the black and white certainty of clauses and signatures. There was something grounding about rules that didn't waver. By the time I was a senior in high school, I knew I wanted to be the one protecting people like Grandma, ordinary folks trying to do the right thing in a world full of loopholes and sharp-toothed opportunists. Grandma encouraged me every step of the way. She helped me apply to ROTC. She helped me study for exams. She was there at my commissioning ceremony when I raised my right hand and swore to serve the United States Navy as a Judge Advocate General Officer. My parents didn't come. They sent a text message, "Congrats, kid, do well." I didn't feel hurt anymore, not really, just hollow. Grandma hugged me so tight my uniform wrinkled and she whispered, "I'm proud of you." You're going to make the world a fairer place. It would be years before I realized how much that whisper meant. When I was 36 after a long deployment and a rotation at a naval legal command, Grandma passed away. Peacefully, quietly, holding my hand. I thought the grief would swallow me whole. But nothing could prepare me for what came next. My parents suddenly reappearing wide-smiled and pretending to cry, insisting they were family, and demanding to know what Grandma had left them. And when they discovered she had left them nothing, they sued me, accusing me of manipulating an elderly woman to change her will. That's how we ended up in that courtroom. Me, them, 4.7 million, and the truth Grandma trusted me to protect. If you'd asked anyone in Maple Falls who raised me, they wouldn't have said my parents. They would have said Margaret Lawson's granddaughter. And they would have said it with a certain warmth because Grandma had that effect on people. She was the kind of woman who waved at every passing neighbor, baked pies for sick church members, and remembered the birthdays of people she hadn't seen in 20 years. And somehow she managed to raise me to believe this world, despite its rough edges, was mostly good. My earliest memories weren't of toys or trips like other children talked about. They were of home-warm cornbread on the table, the sound of Grandma humming gospel songs while folding laundry, and the creak of the old rocking chair by the fireplace where she read to me on cold nights. She loved telling me stories from her life, not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones that shaped her character. Stories about building her hardware shops one customer at a time, or negotiating the purchase of a rental property with a handshake and a promise. She'd tell me about her father who taught her never to lie and her mother who believed a good heart could solve half the world's problems. But the world she gave me wasn't built on naive optimism. It was built on discipline work and integrity. Every Saturday morning, while other kids watched cartoons, I was learning how to sweep aisles in the hardware stores, how to clean shelves, how to fold receipts, how to balance a ledger. Grandma wasn't trying to make me work, she was making me capable. You never know when life will expect you to stand on your own 2 feet, she'd say, as she handed me a dusting rag. Better to learn early. I didn't mind. I liked the routine. I liked being useful. And I liked the way Grandma looked at me with quiet pride whenever I finished a task without being asked. My parents floated in and out of my childhood like passing storms, loud, disruptive, and always leaving a mess behind. They never stayed long. A few hours here, a few hours there. They'd show up talking about debts, new jobs, failed businesses, just needing a little help, and then vanish again. I remember being 12 when my father angrily asked Grandma why she didn't loan him a little cash to invest in a real opportunity. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking around her modest living room, as if he were too good for it. Grandma, who rarely raised her voice, simply said, "Daniel, I don't invest in mistakes that refuse to learn." He left in a huff. My mother followed behind him, sighing dramatically. They didn't say goodbye to me. As the screen door shut, I waited for Grandma to say something sharp or bitter, but she didn't. She just picked up her knitting and nodded toward the kitchen. "Come help me with dinner, sweetheart." That was her way moving forward, not dwelling on anger. It was a lesson I would need more than I realized. In high school, I wasn't the popular girl or the funny girl or the athletic girl. I was the grandma girl, the one teachers smiled at because I was polite and reliable. I studied hard, not because anyone pressured me, but because I wanted to give back to the woman who'd given me everything. Then one day a Navy recruiter came to our school. I expected to ignore the presentation most kids did, but he mentioned something that made every nerve in my body sit up straight. "You can serve your country as a lawyer. It's called JAG, Judge Advocate General. You can defend sailors, prosecute crimes, work in real courts, and make a difference." A military lawyer, serving my country, standing for people who needed help, using the law not as a weapon, but as a shield. Something inside me clicked. I went home that afternoon and told Grandma everything, every detail, every possibility, every flutter of excitement in my chest. She listened quietly while stirring a pot of vegetable soup, her face thoughtful. Then she turned to me, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, and said, "If that's the path your heart chooses, I'll walk beside you as long as I can." And she did. Through the entrance tests, the interviews, the physical exams, Grandma backed me with unshakable support. She prayed for me every night before my training. She bought me my first print copy of the U.S. Constitution and placed it in my backpack. And when the acceptance letter came, "Congratulations, you have been commissioned into the United States Navy JAG Corps," she cried like she hadn't cried since her husband died. My parents didn't call, didn't text, didn't send a card. But Grandma showed up in a navy blue dress standing among military families who looked like they'd stepped out of recruitment posters. She was so short among the tall uniforms and crisp salutes, but she held her head high when I walked across the stage and took my oath. Afterward, she hugged me so tightly I thought my nameplate would dent. "I always knew you were meant for something strong, Sarah." Service life changed me. I rotated to bases across the country: Norfolk, San Diego, Pensacola. I sat in cramped offices writing briefs late into the night, stood in courtrooms fighting for sailors who'd made bad choices, or simply needed someone to believe in them, and learned from senior officers who demanded excellence. I grew into myself, maybe for the first time. Every time I returned home on leave, Grandma's health seemed a little frailer, her steps slower, her hands trembling more, her breath shallower. But she never complained. "I'm old, sweetheart," she'd say, smiling. "Getting old is a privilege." We spent long nights talking about life, about justice, about the world. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd watch me with this soft, proud expression that made my chest tighten. One winter, she told me she had updated her will. She handed me the documents in a tidy folder with blue tabs. "You'll understand why when the time comes." I didn't think much of it then. I should have. Because that folder would destroy what little relationship I had left with my parents and drag me into the courtroom where everything would unravel. The phone call came on a quiet Thursday evening while I was stationed in Norfolk reviewing a stack of case files in my apartment. I remember the way the winter light spilled across my desk, the hum of the base traffic outside, and the sharp clipped voice of the nurse on the other end. "Miss Lawson, I'm so sorry. Your grandmother passed peacefully this morning." The world stopped. I didn't speak. Couldn't. My throat closed up like someone had wrapped their hands around it. The nurse kept talking gently, kindly, but her voice turned into distant static. I only heard a few words clearly. "Comfortable? No pain?" holding the folder. That folder. The blue tabbed one she'd given me a year earlier. I flew home the next morning. My dress uniform felt heavier than usual as I walked through the small Maple Falls airport, its old speaker system crackling as it called out flight arrivals. The air smelled like pine and the familiar chill of winter. Maple Falls had always carried the same scent, the same quiet, the same slow pace, but without Grandma waiting at the curb in her old Subaru, the town felt hollow. I expected grief. I didn't expect them. Because standing on the sidewalk looking impatient as if they were waiting for an Uber were my parents, Daniel and Linda Lawson. My father wore an expensive coat that didn't suit him, and my mother held a latte like she was auditioning for some lifestyle magazine. They looked up as I approached, their eyes sweeping over my uniform, then landing on the single ribbon above my pocket, my deployment commendation. My mother was the first to speak. "Well, well, the Navy girl has arrived." There was no warmth, no sorrow, no recognition of what the day meant. My father nodded at me as if we were casual acquaintances. "You got the message, then?" I stared at them. Here it came out smaller than I meant. "We're family," Dad said, shrugging. "We figured we should handle arrangements." "Handle arrangements, not mourn, not grieve, not say goodbye. Just handle." The drive home was silent. I sat in the back seat staring out the window at the familiar red brick storefronts and snowy roads. My mother's perfume filled the car, cloying and artificial, mixing awkwardly with the scent of stale fast food in the cup holders. When we pulled into Grandma's driveway, a cold wind stirred the porch chimes, her favorite set shaped like little bronze leaves. They sounded different without her inside. The house felt wrong, too still, too empty. My parents wandered through her living room like customers browsing a store. They picked up picture frames, opening drawers, rummaging without asking, without even acknowledging me. I finally found my voice. "We should maybe talk about the funeral." Mom waved a hand. "Already handled. We talked to the church." "You did," my words cracked. Dad leaned against the wall like he owned the place. "Yeah, that's why we need to get moving with the will. We want to know what we're working with." A cold spike went through me. "We're not doing this today," I said quietly. But they were already heading toward Grandma's desk. 2 days later, we sat in the small office of attorney Harold Peters, a longtime friend of Grandma's. The place smelled like old books and lemon polish. His white hair framed a face lined with decades of seeing both the best and worst of families. He greeted me with genuine sympathy, then he greeted my parents with caution. When we sat down, he opened a manila folder, Grandma's will. My heart thudded. He began reading. To my granddaughter, Sarah Lawson, I leave my home, my properties, my shares, and all financial accounts, totaling $4.7 million in assets. My parents straightened in their seats like someone had tugged invisible strings. To my son Daniel and his wife Linda, I leave my love and hope they one day understand that a legacy is built on character, not greed. My mother's mouth dropped open. My father turned scarlet. I felt a single tear slip down my cheek, not because of the money, but because of the last line of the will written in Grandma's unmistakable cursive. Sarah, sweetheart, you earned everything I have through the way you loved me. My mother snapped. She manipulated her. She brainwashed an old woman. Dad slammed his palm on the desk. This is ridiculous. Sarah wasn't even around half her life. She was off playing soldier. I inhaled, steadying myself. I was serving our country. Oh, please, Mom scoffed. Don't act noble. You just wanted the inheritance. It was like being 15 again, standing in a kitchen doorway while they hurled insults, ignoring the girl they abandoned. Attorney Peters folded his hands. The will is legally sound. Your mother had full mental capacity. Dad cut him off. We're contesting it. Mom jabbed a finger toward me. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. They stormed out, slamming the office door behind them so hard a picture frame rattled. I didn't move. I couldn't. Attorney Peters placed a gentle hand on mine. Your grandmother trusted you. That will is airtight. But it didn't matter. Because a week later I was served at my grandmother's graveside papers, accusing me of manipulating an elderly woman for personal gain. The humiliation stung deeper than the anger. Neighbors whispered. Co-workers avoided eye contact. The local paper ran an awful headline, Navy officer accused of inheritance fraud by own parents. And suddenly I wasn't just grieving, I was defending my name, my integrity, my grandmother's dignity. The Navy placed me on temporary administrative leave standard procedure for officers under investigation. It wasn't punitive, but it felt like the ground had been ripped from under me. For the first time since childhood, I felt alone. I spent nights at Grandma's house surrounded by her quilts, her teacups, her photo albums, pieces of her life that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and lavender. I slept in her armchair, unable to face her empty bedroom. Every page of the will folder felt like a lifeline, a responsibility, a promise. I swore I would defend her final wish with everything I had. Even if it meant facing my parents in court, even if it meant revealing the one thing I never told them or anyone in Maple Falls. I wasn't just an attorney. I was JAG United States Navy Judge Advocate General. And I was prepared to fight. Grief is a strange thing. It dulls, the world slows everything down, yet somehow sharpens certain truths. And the sharpest truth of all was this. My parents weren't grieving, they were hunting. Their lawsuit wasn't about justice or fairness, it was about control entitlement, and the belief that I didn't deserve anything because they had created me. Blood to them wasn't a bond, it was leverage. The day after being served, I sat alone at Grandma's worn dining table with a mug of untouched coffee staring at the pile of legal documents. Snow fell outside in soft blankets covering the yard she used to tend every spring. The house felt foreign without the gentle shuffle of her slippers or the warmth of her humming. I opened the complaint again, reading the lines that made my stomach twist. The defendant, Sarah Lawson, manipulated an elderly woman suffering from diminished capacity for financial gain. Diminished capacity, Grandma. The woman who ran 3 businesses well into her 70s, the woman who balanced her books by hand and corrected accountants when their math was off, the woman who taught me to read contracts line by line. My jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. I lifted her photo from the table. She was laughing mid-sentence, her eyes crinkled at the corners, sunlight on her silver hair. She'd always said the law was about truth. I wouldn't let hers be twisted. The first step was finding representation. I couldn't represent myself, not in this town, not in this case. Too personal, too emotional. So I drove to Madison and Howe, a reputable firm 2 towns over. The senior partner, Evelyn Howe, was a sharp woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that saw straight through excuses. She shook my hand firmly. "I've heard of your grandmother. She was respected." "Thank you," I whispered. She gestured for me to sit. "Walk me through everything." And I did. Slowly, deliberately, every detail, every memory, every nickel Grandma had earned, every time my parents disappeared only to reappear with outstretched hands. When I finished, Evelyn looked down at the will, flipping each page with deliberate care. "This is clean," she said. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. There's no sign of coercion." "I know," I replied, "but my parents—" She held up a hand. "They're not after justice. They're after access. We'll defend you." But then she leaned back, studying me. "Though I am curious, why didn't you tell me you were JAG?" I froze. "How did you—" She pointed at the insignia pin on my coat collar. I hadn't realized I was still wearing it. "You're Navy JAG," she said. "That's significant, especially in probate disputes." I grimaced. I didn't want people thinking I'm using the military to scare them. Evelyn softened. "You're not using anything. You're simply stating who you are. And judges respect JAG officers. They know the level of discipline, ethics, and training involved. It might help more than you think." Her words stayed with me. But I still wasn't ready to let that be the first card I played. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of interrogatories, depositions, and paperwork. My parents' attorney, Richard Gable, was as oily as they come, slick hair, slick smile, slick promises. The kind of man who said ma'am as a weapon, not a courtesy. He deposed me for 6 hours. 6 hours of twisting my words, implying ulterior motives, suggesting I'd turned Grandma against her real family. Every time he called my parents her natural heirs, something inside me curled. When the deposition ended, he leaned forward and said, "This will go easier if you settle." I met his eyes. "I'm not settling." His smirk wavered. People don't usually fight their own parents in court. "I didn't choose this fight," I said quietly. "They did." The night after the deposition, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked in its old familiar way, but every sound felt amplified, every draft colder. The walls were filled with memories, but without Grandma, it felt like a museum of things I'd lost. Around midnight, I wandered into the living room where her armchair sat by the window. I sank into it and pulled one of her quilts around my shoulders. Her diary lay on the side table. I opened it gently, my fingers tracing her handwriting. She had written reflections about the town, about her properties, about little moments she wanted to remember. Then, on a page dated the year she gave me the will folder, I found something that made my breath catch. "Sarah has grown into a woman of integrity, steady, patient, fair. She will know what to do with what I leave behind. Daniel never learned to handle money without hurting people. I pray he finds his way, but I fear he will resent her." A quiet tear slid down my cheek. This wasn't just a legal case. It was Grandma's final statement of trust, her belief in me, her fear of what her son might do, her acknowledgement that love wasn't always returned. I closed the diary and held it against my heart. "I'll protect this, Grandma," I whispered. "I promise." 2 days before the hearing, my parents showed up at the house again. No warning, no courtesy. My father pushed open the screen door without knocking. "Sarah, we need to talk." I stepped into the hallway, blocking their way. "This isn't your house." He scoffed. "It will be soon." My mother crossed her arms. "We want you to withdraw from the will." "No." Dad stepped closer. "You think you can win this against us?" I swallowed the tremble in my throat. "It's not about winning. It's about honoring Grandma." Mom rolled her eyes so hard it hurt to watch. Margaret was confused. Anyone could see that. "She was sharper than both of you combined," I snapped before I could stop myself. My father's jaw tightened. "You think you're better because you're in the Navy." "I think I'm better because I stayed," I said, voice low, "when you didn't." The silence that followed was thick as cement. Dad finally muttered, "We'll see about that," and turned away. When they left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, I let myself sink to the floor. My hands shook, but my resolve didn't. I wasn't doing this for the money. I was doing it for the woman who raised me, for the life she'd built, for the truth she left behind. The battle lines were drawn. And in 2 days I would walk into that courtroom not as their daughter, but as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lawson, Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Navy. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of Wisconsin winter day where the sky looks like one enormous sheet of steel. I stood in front of Grandma's old bathroom mirror, straightening the collar of my civilian suit, but my eyes kept drifting to the Navy JAG insignia resting on the nightstand. I hadn't planned to wear it, hadn't planned to reveal who I truly was, but Grandma always said truth is a shield, never be afraid to hold it up. So I placed the insignia on my lapel. Outside, the snow crunched under my boots as I walked to my car. Every breath came out in clouds. Maple Falls was waking up slowly, porch lights flicked on chimneys, puffed smoke. The bakery's neon sign blinked open. I paused at the end of the driveway, looking back at the house. Her house. The wind rustled the wind chimes on the porch, and for a moment I swear I heard her voice. "Stand tall, sweetheart." So I did. The courthouse was already buzzing when I arrived. A local reporter raised her camera, but I kept my head down. This wasn't a spectacle. This was my life, my grandmother's legacy. Inside, I took my seat at the defendant's table beside Attorney Evelyn Howe, who adjusted her glasses and whispered, "You're calm." "Good. That'll rattle them." Across from us sat my parents. My mother wore a black coat with a faux fur collar, her chin lifted in manufactured grief. My father sat stiffly, jaw-clenched, eyes cutting toward me with something between resentment and anticipation. Then their attorney, Richard Gable, walked in with the swagger of a man who believed he'd already won. He glanced at us, gave a smug half-smile, and sat down. The bailiff called out, "All rise." Judge Michael Hanover entered, a stern man in his 60s with a gavel-worn expression. He'd served the county for decades and had a reputation for sniffing out lies from a mile away. But what I didn't expect was the way he froze when his eyes met mine. He leaned forward, slightly squinting. "Excuse me," he said slowly, "but are you JAG, ma'am?" His voice echoed through the silent room. Gable's confident grin flickered. My mother's expression faltered. My father stiffened visibly. I rose politely. "Yes, Your Honor, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lawson, United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps." A ripple of whispers passed through the courtroom. Judge Hanover straightened in his seat. "Well," he said softly, "that changes things." And just like that, the ground shifted. Gable recovered first. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "my clients maintain that Miss Lawson—" Lieutenant Commander Judge Hanover corrected sharply. Gable blinked. Lieutenant Commander Lawson manipulated her grandmother, an elderly woman with declining capacity. Judge Hanover looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "Based on what evidence?" Gable gestured broadly. "There were behavioral changes. My clients will testify that Margaret Lawson became distant, distracted, and financially erratic." My father nodded vigorously. She wasn't herself anymore. My mother sniffed. She was confused. I remained still, quiet, let them talk. Gable continued. "The will was changed only a year before her passing, a suspiciously convenient time right after Miss Lawson returned from deployment." Judge Hanover turned to Evelyn. "Your witness wishes to respond." Evelyn stood, flipping open her folder with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, we have medical records, cognitive assessments, and statements from her long-term physician confirming Margaret Lawson's full mental capacity at the time the will was updated." She handed the documents to the clerk. Gable tried to interject, but Judge Hanover held up a hand. "Mr. Gable, I don't need commentary, I can read." My parents' faces fell. Then Evelyn added, "And we have her diary." My breath caught. Evelyn carefully lifted the worn leather book and set it on the evidence table. This was in Margaret's possession until her death. It contains entries referencing her son's past financial recklessness, his attempts to solicit money, and her concern that he would attempt to claim her assets after she passed. Judge Hanover opened the diary to a marked page. Silence filled the room. He read slowly. "Daniel has not changed. He takes, then asks for more. I love him, but I cannot trust him with what I've built. Sarah is steady, strong, and fair. I leave my life's work to the person who earned it through the way she lives." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's eyes burned with something I couldn't name. Gable tried again, voice cracking. Your Honor, diaries are emotional, not factual. Judge Hanover closed the book with a soft thud that silenced the whole courtroom. This is the voice of a competent woman making a thoughtful decision, he said firmly, not the ramblings of someone confused. I exhaled slowly, one step closer. Next came testimony. My parents claimed I pulled away from them, that I alienated Grandma, that I used my military background to intimidate her. But every accusation fell apart under cross-examination. Evelyn asked simple questions. How often did you visit your mother? How much financial support did you provide? When was the last birthday you spent with her? Do you have any written proof that she expressed confusion or coercion? My parents fumbled through vague answers, contradicting themselves repeatedly. But the moment that broke everything open came when Evelyn asked, Mr. Lawson, how much money did you ask your mother for in the last 15 years? Dad sputtered, irrelevant. Judge Hanover responded, highly relevant. Answer the question. My father's face reddened. I don't remember. Evelyn pressed more than 20,000. I said I don't remember. More than 50. Silence. The courtroom watched him unravel. Finally, Evelyn said, Your Honor, we have bank statements. It was over. Even Gable stopped objecting. My parents looked small. Not monstrous, not evil, just small like people who had spent so long trying to fill a hole inside themselves with money that they no longer knew where the hole ended. When testimonies ended, Judge Hanover rubbed his temples, then removed his glasses. This court has heard sufficient evidence. I will issue my ruling shortly. My heart pounded as we waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Finally, he returned. He looked at me first, then at my parents, then at the packed courtroom. After reviewing the evidence testimony and legal documents, this court finds no indication of undue influence or diminished capacity. My breath trembled. Judge Hanover continued. The will of Margaret Lawson stands exactly as written. All assets remain with Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lawson. A murmur of relief moved through the room. My parents sagged in their seats. Judge Hanover added quietly, Justice does not always follow blood. Sometimes it follows character. The words struck something deep inside me. As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lift, not just from winning, but from finally seeing the truth laid bare. When the gavel struck, it was supposed to feel like victory. But sitting there in the silence after Judge Hanover's ruling, all I felt was a strange, aching heaviness, like the air had thickened around me. My parents remained frozen at the plaintiff's table, as if the verdict hadn't fully reached them yet. My mother stared at the polished wood, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father leaned back, jaw-clenched eyes, glassy with something I couldn't identify. Anger, humiliation, loss. Maybe all three. Attorney Gable collected his papers without his usual cocky expression. He didn't even look at me as he closed his briefcase. He only muttered to my parents, "We can discuss options later." But there were no options left. The will stood. Grandma's voice had spoken. And justice, real justice, had been served. When Gable stepped out of the courtroom, the tension snapped like a rubber band. My mother suddenly stood, gathering her purse so quickly she nearly dropped it. "This isn't fair," she whispered harshly, her voice trembling. "It isn't fair to us." My father rose more slowly. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in decades. Not through anger or resentment, but through something gentler, something raw. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. My mother tugged at his sleeve. "Let's go, Daniel." He hesitated, then followed her out. No screaming, no final threat, no dramatic exit. Just silence. When the courtroom emptied, Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You handled yourself with grace, Sarah." "I don't feel graceful," I whispered. "You don't have to." Evelyn gave me a small, almost maternal smile. "You did right by your grandmother. That's all that matters." I knotted my throat tight. As I packed my folders, I felt eyes on me. I turned to see Judge Hanover standing just outside his chambers. He approached slowly, his expression softened from the stern one he wore on the bench. "Lieutenant Commander Lawson," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." He paused, searching my face. "I knew your grandmother, years ago. She once helped my wife during a difficult time with our first home. I never forgot her kindness, Warmth spread through me. She never mentioned that. She wouldn't, he said with a quiet smile. She didn't help people for praise. Neither do you, sir. He folded his hands. You carry yourself a lot like her. She'd be proud of the woman you've become. That did it. The tears came fast, hot, stinging, impossible to hold back. I looked away embarrassed, but the judge shook his head gently. No shame in loving those who raised you right. I managed to whisper thank you. He nodded once, then returned to chambers. Evelyn squeezed my arm. Come on, let's get you home. The drive back to Grandma's house felt surreal. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield, clinging to the edges like tiny reminders of winter's quiet persistence. Maple Falls looked the same as it always did, small, humble, charming. But everything felt different now. I was different now. When we pulled into the driveway, I thanked Evelyn and watched her car disappear down the road. Then I stood alone on the porch, listening to the wind chimes. Grandma's chimes, Grandma's porch, Grandma's world. Mine now. Inside the house greeted me with the scent of cinnamon and dust, familiar, comforting, heartbreaking. I wandered into the living room and sank into her old armchair, pulling a quilt over my lap. Her diary sat on the side table where I'd left it. I picked it up and opened to a random page from 15 years ago. I worry about Daniel. He has such a good heart buried somewhere inside him. I pray life brings him humility before it brings him ruin. I closed the book gently. Some prayers take time, some converge with pain, some don't bloom until you least expect them. A soft knock startled me. I opened the door to find my father standing alone on the porch, snow collecting on his shoulders. For a moment we just looked at each other. He seemed smaller somehow, older, as if the courtroom had stripped away layers he'd spent years hiding behind. Can I? He started gesturing inside. I hesitated but stepped aside. He entered slowly, almost reverently, as if the house itself demanded respect. His eyes lingered on the photos, the mantle, the old family Bible still on the shelf. He finally turned to me. I'm not here to fight, he said quietly, or ask for money. His voice cracked a little. That alone was enough to twist something inside my chest. I read the diary, he continued. Before the hearing, I found it on the evidence table. I shouldn't have, but I did. My heart tightened. She wrote about me, he whispered. About things I didn't want to see. Things I pretended weren't true. I stayed silent. He swallowed. I wasn't a good son to her, and I wasn't a good father to you. My breath hitched, but I remained still. I always thought money was the bridge I could walk across to make things right, he said. But I see now, money was the fire burning the bridge down. He stepped closer. I'm not asking forgiveness, he said gently. Only a chance, a small one, just to talk, to try again. My eyes filled with tears. You hurt me, I whispered. I know, he said, voice breaking, and if you'd rather I leave, I will. But I never want to hurt you again. For a long moment all I heard was the ticking of Grandma's old clock. Finally I nodded, a tiny nod, but a nod. He exhaled shakily. Thank you, he whispered. We sat on the sofa, not talking, not rebuilding, not yet. Just sitting. And maybe that was enough for now. Later that night after he left, I stepped onto the porch and looked up at the frosted moon. The town was quiet, still, peaceful. I pressed my hand to the wooden railing, feeling the grain beneath my palm, the same place Grandma used to rest her hand when she watched the sunset. Justice isn't about punishment, she once told me. It's about guiding hearts back to truth. Maybe that's what was happening now. Maybe justice had done more than protect my inheritance. Maybe it had cracked something open, something buried, something stubborn, something capable of healing. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I let myself hope. In the weeks after the court ruling, Maple Falls felt different, not because the buildings changed or the seasons shifted, but because I had. It was as if a weight I'd carried my entire life had finally loosened, letting me breathe without bracing for the next blow. Yet victory, true victory, never feels as sharp as the moment it's won. It settles slowly like snow on a quiet street. The day after my father visited, I found myself waking early, the pale winter sun spilling through the curtains. I brewed tea the way Grandma taught me, slowly, patiently, letting the leaves steep just right. The house felt warmer somehow. Not because anything had changed, but because something inside me had. Healing always begins quietly. I stepped outside, steaming cup in hand, and walked down the porch steps. The yard was covered in fresh snow, soft as cotton, untouched except for a few rabbit tracks. The air had that crispness only small-town mornings can hold, the kind that makes you feel like the world is starting over right along with you. I stood there a long moment, breathing, letting the cold burn my lungs clean. That's when I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I turned. My father stood at the end of the driveway, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, head slightly bowed. I didn't speak, neither did he. We simply stared, unsure if yesterday's fragile truce would hold. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Morning." I nodded. "Morning." He hesitated, kicked at the snow like he used to when I was a kid. "I brought something." From his pocket, he pulled out a small box wrapped in worn newspaper. With slow steps, he approached and held it out to me. I took it carefully. Inside was an old Polaroid photo, one I'd never seen before. My grandmother sat on a porch swing, holding me as a baby, bundled in a pink blanket. My father stood behind her, younger, smiling, really smiling before life bent him the wrong way. "I found it," he whispered. "In a drawer at my place. Thought you might want it." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I said softly, "Thank you." He nodded and looked away, swallowing hard. "I don't know where to begin," he said. "I've messed up more than I can count. I hurt you, hurt her, hurt myself." His voice trembled and he blinked fast, like he was fighting something inward. "I can't change what I did," he whispered, "but I want to change now." I studied him, the slump in his shoulders, the cracks in his voice, the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. For the first time, I didn't see the father who abandoned me. I saw the man who never learned how to be better. "That starts with honesty," I said gently. He winced but nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." It didn't erase the pain, didn't undo the years, didn't heal everything in a single breath. But it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up groceries. Maple Falls was busy with holiday preparations, lights strung between lampposts, shop windows painted with snowflakes, wreaths hanging from every door. People bustled along the sidewalks, bundled in scarves and mittens. Inside the small market, Mrs. Turner from the pharmacy waved at me. "Sarah, good news travels fast. Your grandmother would be proud." "Thank you," I replied. Others came up, 2 kind words, pats on the shoulder, warm smiles. Not because I'd won. Because Maple Falls had loved Margaret Lawson, and they understood that what happened in court was bigger than money. It was about respect, legacy, fairness. At checkout, the young clerk looked at the JAG insignia on my coat and said, "Ma'am, thank you for your service." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You're welcome." Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells. I paused, listening. Grandma used to say bells were reminders, gentle nudges that life was still happening all around us. I let the sound settle in my chest. Then I drove home. That evening, as twilight blurred into night, I sat in the living room with Grandma's diary open in my lap. I turned to the last page, the one she wrote just weeks before her passing. "Justice is not a fight. It is a way of living. May Sarah carry that truth, and may it guide her steps even when the world is unkind." I pressed my fingers to the ink, the indentations where her pen once moved, and I felt her with me. A quiet peace, a steady presence. That's when the phone rang. My mother's name lit the screen. It took me a moment before I answered. "Sarah," she said, her voice unsteady. I heard your father visited." "Yes." A shaky breath. "I know I've made mistakes, a lot of them. I don't expect anything. But if one day you'd be willing to sit with me too, I'd like that." Her words were uncertain, fragile, but real. "I'm not ready," I said honestly. "I understand," a pause, "but I'll wait." For the first time in perhaps my entire life, she meant it. When I hung up, the house felt fuller, as if Grandma's walls had exhaled, relieved that something broken was finally beginning to mend. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into restoring the property. I repainted the porch railings, fixed the old gate, repaired the loose shingles on the shed. I even planted bulbs in the frozen garden, hope buried under frost, waiting for spring. Every hammer tap, every sweep of the brush felt like stitching the past into something whole. One day, standing beside the garden beds, I whispered, "I'm doing my best, Grandma." And for the first time, I felt like that was enough. As winter deepened, I returned to my Navy post with my record intact, my leave reinstated, and a new perspective in my heart. My commanding officer shook my hand and said, "The Navy is proud of you, Lieutenant Commander." But it was Grandma's words that echoed most. Justice follows character. I carried that with me into every case, every hearing, every sailor's story I was trusted to defend. I carried Maple Falls with me too, and I carried that fragile new bridge forming between me and my parents, a bridge made not of money but of slow, patient truth. Now to you listening to my story. If you've ever been abandoned, doubted, or betrayed, if you've ever had to fight for what was right, while others tried to rewrite your truth, if you've ever wondered whether justice still matters, I hope my grandmother's legacy whispers something to you tonight. Justice is not a verdict. It's a way of choosing to live, a way of choosing to forgive, a way of choosing to believe in yourself, in truth, in second chances. And if this story touched you, drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, or share your own journey. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. 1 second for you, a world of difference for us. 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 Difference for us.